we do want to bring in Michael Gottlieb, who is a criminal defense attorney, to share more about this. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks for having me on.
Before we went on, we were just discussing, again, the difference between the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech versus hate speech, and crossing the line there legally when we take a look at these protests, because, again, some of them have been peaceful, many have not been, talking about just the use of language. What is, from the legal perspective, the difference between peacefully protesting and then it going into the territory of hate speech and really breaking the law?
So, it's really an interesting question. Our Constitution, the United States Constitution, protects us from governmental overreach. And in doing so, the founders said, the First Amendment, you have freedom of speech. And hate speech is actually guaranteed. You can say hateful, harmful things. However, hate speech is still subject to time, manner, and place restrictions, meaning you shouldn't be able to get up during a graduation ceremony and engage in hate speech, because the university, the government, should be able to regulate the time, the manner, and the place in which you're engaging in this speech. A peaceful protest, especially if they notified the university of where they're going to be and what they're going to say, regardless of what they say, should be allowed to happen. It's when you cross that line and you interfere with students getting to class, prohibiting students, barricading themselves, then you've gone beyond speech and you're taking actions that violate the United States Constitution.
And we've been hearing a lot from the Jewish community, both students and staff. We've been hearing them from Columbia University, UCLA, among many, saying that they don't feel safe on their own campuses, that they don't feel as though they are being protected because they have been on the receiving end of anti-Semitism. Does that cross the line?
Making somebody feel uncomfortable doesn't necessarily cross the line. But I think the issue really is the response of the universities was very laissez-faire, and many of the universities actually, the professors were known at the University of Michigan. They were telling kids, you can skip class, you can participate, encouraging college students to skip class and participate in the protests. And other universities allowing the encampments, and you've seen videos, we've all seen videos where the security that's there to protect the kids on both sides aren't engaging when things turn physical. And so I think the problem is that this has gone beyond a peaceful protest of Gaza and has turned into anti-American sentiment, and again, stopping people from going to class, which is what you're at university to do, is an infringement of that person's constitutional rights. And it's really gone beyond that. It's well beyond freedom of speech at this point.
And again, we have seen some universities transition to hybrid learning, remote learning. In fact, there was one instance in California where they canceled graduation because, again, they were worried about the security of everyone there. When it comes to responding, and I'm curious, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there a difference when it comes to private universities and public universities? Do they follow different rules when it comes to bringing in police or handling these types of protests?
So that's an incredibly intricate and great question. Arguably, a private institution can do whatever they want. However, most private institutions receive funding from the United States government, whether it's in terms of grants, research grants, so on and so forth. And I think we heard Speaker Johnson correctly say, we're going to look at the amount of money that we're giving to these institutions, whether they're private or public, and we're going to restrict the funds, if they're encouraging anti-American sentiment, hate speech, and coddling our enemies. Israel is the only democracy in that region of the world. And when you hear people saying, I am Hamas and I stand with the regime in Iran, again, that's going beyond freedom of speech. And, one could argue is terrorism or even treason. So I think if a private university is getting funds from the United States government, they should have, they're subject to certain restrictions as well. They're no longer a private actor.
And we also saw that many of these protesters are outside agitators. There's no affiliation with the campus or the university itself. These are outsiders that have come down to incite these protests legally. And I'm curious here from the legal standpoint. Obviously, thousands have been arrested, as part of these protests. But when you stand before a judge, does it matter who you are if you're a student versus you're an outside agitator? Because they actually had to physically go on campus and they're not even a student there.
So potentially, if they're charged with trespass, it's going to matter because the university is saying, look, you're not allowed to be here. The university is for students. However, they're open. It's, again, another complex problem. The First Amendment allows freedom of speech. It also allows freedom of association. So these, excuse me, outside agitators, they're going to have a defense, and somebody like me is going to defend them for those activities.
What are your thoughts moving forward? Because again, these protests aren't stopping. And we've seen thousands of people arrested. We have seen some pretty shocking situations, especially we're taking a look at Colombia, where police officers had to physically enter into Hamilton Hall because protesters barricaded themselves inside that building. We have seen windows smashed. We have seen just all sorts of situations. When you take a look at it, where does it go from here? And how can this best be handled? I know these are very large questions.
Yeah. So, it's really unfortunate that it's gotten to this level, that they've had to bring in police force, that they've brought in special response teams that are climbing through windows because students and agitators are barricading themselves in, which is a burglary, which is a trespass, which, it's gone beyond peaceful protest. It's unfortunate that the government's had to get involved in that respect. But I think the universities play a large role in allowing the protests to get that far out of hand. Excuse me.
So legally, what you mentioned trespassing. What other charges might these protesters be facing?
Depending on how heavy-handed the government wants to get, and I would encourage them to. You have conspiracy, you have trespass, you have burglary. Burglary is a felony. Excuse me, I have.
No, that's okay. And if you want to take a drink of water, feel free. I get it. Because again, we have seen, and in certain circumstances, we have seen protests that are peaceful, that are relegated to maybe a certain area of the campus. But we have also seen situations turn quite ugly, specifically coming to mind UCLA and Columbia. So again, I imagine that the charges in those situations might be quite different from other situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you're conspiring with entities known and unknown. And we've seen all these people sharing the same tents at different universities. They have the same tent. So there's a faction that's putting this together. So I could absolutely see a conspiracy charge, which is very heavy handed in most jurisdictions, a first-degree felony punishable by up to 30 years. So you could see conspiracy, burglary in most places for entering the building is punishable by 5 to 15 years. So, I could see that. And again, like I said, some of these agitators are saying things supporting our enemies. And when you support the United States enemies, that is treason under our Constitution. And I doubt that anybody would be prosecuted for treason, but I'd certainly like to see them try. Some of the statements that they are saying are harmful to the U.S., have nothing to do with the situation going on between Israel and Gaza. If I'm a prosecutor and you really want to get aggressive, and I think that we should, because it's time to send a message, I could see conspiracy and treason.
And again, you mentioned sending a message, because I imagine that many of these protesters will find themselves before a judge and have their case tried in court. What message do you think this needs to send? Again, as we have seen thousands of protesters all across the United States, many of these protests turning violent. What is the message that needs to be sent, in your opinion?
I think first and foremost, when you've seen a lot of these people being interviewed, they have no idea what they're even protesting. I saw a protest yesterday where somebody had a shirt on that said "War No More," and the person standing next to them was wearing a shirt that said "Let's support the Intifada." So if you're support, it just doesn't make sense. They don't have a biblical history that understands that region. They don't have a recent history that understands that region. I think that as part of any punishment, certainly if there's going to be no jail or prison time, we need to re-educate our students. And I think that I would love to see some kind of punishment if it's not going to be jail or prison, and especially for some of the more serious offenders, I think it ought to be. But I think that there should be an education and an understanding of the geopolitical situation and how they're adding to the harm.
And you bring up a good point that there really just needs to be education when it comes to what is actually happening in the world. From a legal standpoint, though, I have to imagine, especially with, more than 2,000 people, protesters being arrested, does that create a bottleneck situation? Does that create a strain on the legal system as there has to be due process and then other cases are, kind of delayed because of all of this?
No, I mean, I think we've seen before. Our system is equipped to handle these prosecutions, and we're talking about 2,000 scattered throughout the United States. Now, I haven't looked at each state to see how many they've had, but there's state and federal jurisdictions. So I don't think it'll create a bottleneck, not at all.
Michael, before we let you go, any last thoughts on what we have been seeing play out across the United States?
Just sort of echo the same things that I've said here. I really think that this is an educational failing that we've had, and I think it starts in our civics classes up through college. I think it's an educational failing when we look at the amount of money that a lot of these Qatar and Iran have been giving to our United States institutions, our institutions of higher learning, and how they've really infiltrated the minds of our young students. I think the lesson is that we need to stick with our American values. We need to teach what's going on around the world, but I don't think that our institutions should be accepting funds from countries that we have labeled as terrorist countries, and adopting their teachings, because it is clearly indoctrinating our young minds, and that's going to take a generation to recover from. And I think that that's incredibly unfortunate.
One last thought, because again, you are an attorney, and we were discussing the response from universities, or what you said was the lack of timely response. What are university attorneys sharing with the college presidents? What advice are the attorneys giving? Because I have to imagine that they are advising the presidents on how to handle such situations. Would that play into the fact that there really has been perhaps delayed responses on many of these campuses?
Yeah, but I don't think they're giving the right advice from what I've seen. Like I said, everyone's entitled to freedom of speech, but they should be instructing the university presidents about the time, place, and manner restrictions. You should not be able to disrupt school functions. And when we see a disruption of school functions, that is something that is prohibited by our case law and our statutes that have interpreted the First Amendment. So I think the lawyers were concerned that the universities are going to be viewed as if they are infringing on the First Amendment, and they're not. You just need to be able to apply. For instance, you can require a permit to hold a protest. That's appropriate. And if there's no permit, you can't hold the protest, and therefore the violators should be removed. I just don't think that the attorneys, I think they're afraid of the universities looking like they're infringing on free speech, and they're not. We need to exercise our constitutional powers when we have them.
All right, Michael Gottlieb, criminal defense attorney, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox on this Saturday. We appreciate it.
Thank you.